Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 12-game college basketball slate. We have a ton of games here. I'm going to kind of break down each game real quick and then get into it. Before I do that, though, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really helps the channel a lot. Really do appreciate it. With that said, we have Villanova versus Xavier. That game is projected to be a 5-point spread in Xavier's favor, and it's also one of the higher scoring games on the slate at 148 points. Kansas State and Baylor are playing, and that has a 1-point spread in favor of Baylor with virtually the same amount of points at 146. Pittsburgh and Georgia Tech is one of the more lopsided games, with Pittsburgh having an 11-point edge here. And it's also one of the lowest scoring games at 137 points. For the Virginia Tech and Miami game, this game has a 3-point edge for Virginia Tech, and also the highest scoring game on the slate, with Virginia Tech winning at 154 points. Then we have Missouri and Mississippi State, who Missouri is projected to win by about 4 points, and this has a pretty low spread as well, or total as well, at 138. For Texas A&M and Tennessee, this is actually the lowest point game on the slate, and it's also a 2-point edge to Texas A&M. At 129 points, that is the lowest on this slate overall. Then we're going to look at Creighton and Marquette, and Creighton is projected to win this game by 5 points. It's also one of the highest scoring games on the slate at 148 points. Then we're going to have Oklahoma and Texas Tech. Oklahoma is favored to win this by 2 points, and it has one of the lower totals at 137. Texas and Iowa State are playing. Texas is favored to win this game by 7. And it has a 136-point total. For Arkansas and Georgia, Arkansas's got the biggest spread on the slate at -14 in favor of Arkansas. It's also a pretty high-scoring game at 142. That's good for, I think, 4th on this slate. Then Michigan State and Indiana have a 3-point spread between them. Michigan State favored to win, and one of the lowest scoring games on the slate at 135. And then last but not least, San Diego State and Colorado State, which has an 11-point spread for San Diego State with a 135-point total. So obviously we have some pretty interesting aspects here. Creighton obviously looks somewhat interesting in their matchup here, being a high-scoring game and a tight game. And then some of the even low-scoring games like Texas A&M and Tennessee do look interesting simply because they have tight spreads. But I don't think necessarily that you're going to want to get a lot of guys from that particular game. And some of these Big Ten matchups also seem like they're pretty low scoring. So, but we do have plenty of availability here. There's not as much value today, like just jumping off the page value that I typically like to see on a big slate like this. So do keep that in mind. But there's still 5 or 6 guys that we're going to look at that are sub $5,000. I do have 4 core plays here, being Anthony Black, Nick Smith Jr., Justin Mutz, and Joey Hauser, and I will talk about those guys as I go through. I'm going to start with the guards here, and we're going to start with Anthony Black, in fact. Now, he is the most expensive guard on the slate for me, but he's also my favorite player on the slate when it comes to guards. The only real risk here is a big blowout by Arkansas, but overall, he has some really good upside here. I don't really see him having a bad game in this situation. He has nice upside. He's even done pretty good in the blowout type games that Arkansas has had, and so I expect him to play well and to exceed our projection, our fantasy points needed, which is around 32. He has 45 fantasy point upside. Then we're gonna look at Jordan Miller. Now, obviously, I don't like him as much as I like Black, but he's still in a pretty good spot here, and he's a good alternative if you just want to be contrarian. He does have a little bit lower floor than Black does, but he has just as high of a ceiling, and he's played pretty well lately, though he hasn't been quite as good as Black has, but he's been really good against Virginia Tech in 2 of the last 3 games against them, where he scored more than 30 fantasy points, and if he's able to do that, then he'll definitely pay off for us here. Then we're going to look at sorry about that. Then we're going to look at Tyler Kolek for Marquette, and again, he's also in a similar price range as the previous 2. He's actually got a little bit more upside than Jordan Miller, he's got better floor than Jordan Miller, but he doesn't quite have the upside. He is relatively safe though. So if you need a safe option for a utility spot and you have $8,000 left over, he would be probably my primary option, assuming you're using Black or Miller already. And this game should be pretty tight, and he has some good upside as a result of that. Then we're going to look at Marcus Carr at $8,000 as well. He has a decent floor here. He also has a nice upside, which is a little bit higher than Kolik's, but he does have 4 straight games over 30 fantasy points, and he's in a really solid matchup here. So I do think he's in a good spot. I really do like Texas right now in this situation. And then we're going to look at Adam Flagler, also at $7,900. He doesn't really have the big time ceiling that some of the other guys have here. You know, he's not over 40 fantasy points, but he does have a pretty safe floor, and he's been pretty good lately. Not only that, but he has a high scoring. He's in a high scoring game that gives him an advantage here as well, and that should be a fun game and a pretty tight game at the on that front. Then we're going to look at Isaiah Stevens for Colorado State. Now, his team isn't favored to win, but he's been really solid this season. The matchup is pretty tough, though, and I would say consider using him lightly as a good alternative option in a utility spot. He has some good games versus San Diego State in the past, but also some really bad ones. He's had 8 games against them where he's been over 30 minutes, and he's scored anywhere from 8 to 46 fantasy points. Obviously, on the high end, that's really solid, but on the low end, that's, kind of risky. But he is interesting and useful here. Then we're going to look at Ryan Nimhard for Creighton. And I really do like Creighton today. They have a nice situation. He's a little bit safer than one of the other options from Creighton, which is Trey Alexander, who I'll talk about in a second. Nimhard is also a decent play on the slate. And I do think that he has some good upside here, but he's a little bit more expensive than Alexander, and while Alexander has a better ceiling, just as good of a ceiling as he does. Then we're going to look at Devion Harmon for Texas Tech, and at $7,200, his floor is pretty low, which I don't like, but he has really good upside for a player that's $7,000, and he has really just as much upside as some of the other, like Carr and Flagler I already mentioned, and even Kolik. And he has a good matchup here against Oklahoma, and 6 of the last 7 games against, in his last in the last 7 games he's played, he's had 6 over 27 fantasy points. He has a really good upside in this matchup. I think he's a great play on the slate in general. And then finally, Trey Alexander, he really close to being a core play for me, but he has some nice upside. He's got a good ceiling. His floor is a little bit lower than I like, and that's what really kept him from being out. But he is on a team that's in a good spot, and he's under $7,000, which is actually surprising. I expected him to be closer to $8,000 today, and he's on a high-scoring team that's expected to have a really good game. So I do think he's in a top-tier option as well. Then we're gonna go ahead and get in our forwards. Now I'm gonna do the sub $5,000 guys at the end, so just stay tuned for that. We're gonna start with Trace Jackson Davis. He's the most expensive player on the slate. I don't necessarily think that he's a requirement to use today. He has had 11 straight games over 45 fantasy points, and he's been a machine as of late. He has also been getting double-doubles and stuff like that. But the matchup isn't as ideal as I'd like it to be, just because it's a tough matchup against Michigan State. But he's had big games against them before, and he obviously has as much upside as anybody on the slate by a large margin. But his price is extremely expensive, which kept him from being a core play today. And from that perspective, Justin Mutz is the next guy I'm going to talk about, Virginia Tech, who basically has just as much upside as Jackson Davis does, almost at least. And he's a heck of a lot cheaper, and he is one of my favorite plays on the slate. He's definitely the best player at forward, and arguably the best player to choose from on the slate in general. He has big-time upside here, and he's been getting points, rebounds, and assists a lot. He may be my favorite play on the slate. Obviously, he's not a double-double machine like Jackson Davis is, which hurts him slightly, but he gets more of every other stats, which helps. And so that gives him a top-tier option here. And if you want to go off of him, go to his teammate Grant Basil. Now, he has a little bit more risky than Mutz does, simply because He is a little bit more inconsistent, has a little bit lower of a floor, but he does have just as much upside as Mutz and Jackson Davis does as well. And again, he's a similar price to Mutz, so he is somebody that's very viable on the slate. He's a good alternative if you want to be contrarian to Mutz, but I think both players have a lot of potential to be great in this game. Then we're going to look at Tolu Smith at $8,000. He has a good upside here, and he's played pretty well. I really like him in a tight matchup, and he has some recent double-doubles. He has some nice upside as a result of the matchup, especially against Missouri. Now, Missouri does play kind of a smash-mouth kind of game, and I expect him and Missouri's big guys to kind of battle a lot. But he has a nice upside for this matchup, though it's a little bit less than the previous two guys I mentioned, but he's also a little bit cheaper. Then we're going to look at Javon Franklin for Georgia Tech. Now, he's a little bit cheaper than Tolu Smith, and he has actually just as much upside, and he's actually been better as of late. He's been inconsistent throughout the season, but since he's been starting, he's been hitting 34 fantasy points in 6 straight games. He's a little bit risky, but he does have nice upside, and he's a little bit safer than Tolu Smith just from the perspective of how he's played as of late. Then we're going to look at Eric Dixon for Villanova. At $7,600, he's a little bit cheaper than what I expected him to be here. Though this team isn't favored to win, he has been playing pretty consistently, and he has a higher floor than most of the other options on the slate. He's been over 40 fantasy points in the upside situation, and he's had a couple games over that amount, and so his ceiling is actually pretty good here, especially in a matchup that's relatively tight, and it is high scoring as well, though his team is favored to lose, so do keep that in mind. Then we're going to look at Joey Hauser, who is one of my core plays for this slate for Michigan State. Now, he's had some really good games lately, and he's got big-time upside here. He's got just as much upside as anybody I've mentioned outside the top 3 for the forwards, and his price is a lot more reduced than some of the others, which gives him some good opportunity in a tight game, who he had 30 fantasy points against last time, and if he can do that, then he'll definitely pay off for us here. He seems like a really great option on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Cameron Matthews, last but not least for the forwards, at $6,700 for Mississippi State. Now, you can keep in mind, you can also play guard, so if you want to utilize him there, you can do that as well. And at $6,700, his floor is low for his price, but he does have good upside, and he plays well, and he rebounds well, and he's played pretty solid as of lately. It is still a toughish matchup here, but I do think he and also Tolu Smith both have some upside here. But if I was going to choose between them, I would probably go with Cameron Matthews just because he's cheaper. But obviously, he doesn't have quite the floor, or ceiling, I should say, as Tolu Smith. With that said, that's what I have for our guards and forwards. I'm going to get into 5 value plays that are under $5,000. And we're going to start with Nick Smith, who is one of my core plays today. I think he is a great option here for Arkansas. Now, he's been inconsistent, as you can see in his scoring here. He hasn't played a lot this season, but he is back from injury. Last game was really the first game that he's played a lot in quite a while, and as long as his minutes continue to be in the 30s going forward, he should have a really good opportunity here at $4,900. Just way too cheap for his potential. And not only that, but he has... I expect his price to skyrocket after these next couple games, so get him while you can. I think he's probably my favorite play from a value perspective. Then we're going to look at Miller Kopp from Indiana. His floor is slightly lower than I'd like it to be, but he doesn't need a ton of points to pay off for us at $4,500, and it should be a pretty tight game, and he has some good upside here. His scoring output has been inconsistent, but his price is low enough that he has a decent value option. So I do think he's a good play. I just don't think he's a great play. Like I told you at the beginning, there's not a ton of high-end value options, but there are some decent ones, and he is one of them. Then we're going to look at Uzan for Oklahoma at $4,300. He has been a starter since December. He's had only 2 games under 12 fantasy points in that time. He's been over 20 fantasy points quite a few times. I think he's one of the better options and these cheap guys to utilize in the slate, and he also is a guard, so he's definitely in a great spot. I think that if you compare him with the Nick Smith then you have some good opportunity there to pay up for some of the forwards that we want to, and some other potential options. So I think he's a great option for the slate. Then we're going to look at Langston Love at $4,100. He seems like he's in a pretty decent spot, though he has been inconsistent. He does have a really low floor, but he also has a really high ceiling, probably higher than most of the other guys I've already mentioned at this slate, outside of maybe Nick Smith. But he should have around 20 or so minutes here, and if he can do that, then he should be able to pay off for us here. But he's a little bit inconsistent, so to keep that in mind. He's got a very low floor. As you can see, he had a 2 fantasy point game. It's somewhat scoring dependent. He has games where he scores over 10 regular points, but he's had some zeros and stuff. So he is a little bit inconsistent from that perspective. Patrick Carter is the last guy that I'm going to, or Cartier, I guess, is the last guy I'm going to talk about. Sorry for butchering your name. From Colorado State. He's been starting since mid-December. He's been over 14 fantasy points in all but a couple of those games, and he's got decent upside here. He's a little bit more risky than some of the other value plays, but if you're gonna, he is somebody that you have to consider at $5,000. He's got about the same kind of upside as Love and Cope and Uzan does. So I think all four of them have some value, but I do think he's probably the riskiest one simply because he's a little bit more expensive. But he has been pretty good as of late as well, and he does have some decent upside, so he can get in the mid-30s in fantasy, just given the fact that he's starting and getting more minutes. He gets a little bit more of an upside tick than Langston Love does because of the starting position. So with that said, guys, that's what I have for the slate. It is a wild slate. It's going to be really difficult, I think, to fit in all the expensive guys that we want, but we can utilize some $6,500 to $7,000 players to kind of mix in to help us get some value plays and hopefully make some really solid lineups today and get some wins. With that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. Please smash that like and subscribe button. It really helps the channel. Thanks again, and have a nice day, guys.